Hello, Story Seekers. I'm Ben.
I'm Nico, and you're listening to the Tiny Bookcase.
We are now into the third week of our Nano season.
And our approach to the challenge has evolved into editing rather than raw word creation.
NaNoWriMo challenges writers to pen 50,000 words in the month of November.
Whereas we are now chewing through editing word counts with the ultimate goal of final drafts of our novels.
So far, in this Nano season, we've explored a first draft from Nico and a mid-draft by myself. And in this episode, we'll be hearing Nico's mid-draft and finding out how it's going.
Well, it is going.
Mid-draft. Mid-draft.
It's,
What is a mid-draft? It's sort of like a pointless phrase, that, isn't it? Like, a draft is a draft. What's a mid-draft? Does it mean it's not done?
It's very reticent of my unwillingness to call it draft 1 until it's had a pass, but no, then it's draft 2. It's the mid-draft. It's the mid-giraffe, like a deer. You know?
The mid-giraffe. Like a deer? Like a muntjac with like a 12-foot neck. Just tiny little body. It's got a sheaf of parchment in its clutched between its teeth. You've got to catch it to get the next draft done.
I reckon you could breed dogs to be really tough. I want a chihuahua, right? So half chihuahua, half giraffe. Like a really long but very small dog. I think
trying to get a chihuahua to mount a giraffe is going to be tricky, my friend.
It's all about levers and pulleys, mate.
Step ladders, yeah.
It's basic machines, isn't it? Levers, pulleys, wedges.
Just shove a wedge up a giraffe and sort it out with a chihuahua. Got yourself a chihuahua. Right, we're so off topic, but I do feel like we're going to say draft a lot in this episode, so
Yes.
it was a good idea to get that out of the way at the start. Because there's sort of editing is the process, but then drafting is also a process, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like drafting is a bit more macro, like, first draft, second draft, third draft, and that's like hundreds of thousands of words. Whereas you can edit a page.
Yes.
And it's all sort of tied together. But it's sort of important to understand how that works, because anything that you see on the shelf of Waterstones or any other book, sort of local bookshop, must have seen a drafting process and huge amounts of editing from the writer, and then very likely it's had either one or multiple editors go through it as well. And I mean, yeah, it's a huge part of the process. This idea that NaNoWriMo has of like you will end up with a novel at the end of November is absolute bollocks. It's just beyond bollocks. For a start, 50,000 words is nowhere near a fucking book. And the words that come out if you write, several thousand words a day for 1 month in order to hit that goal are also just absolutely shite. So it's a bit of an odd challenge because it does break the dam a little bit, and it proves that you can write that many words, and that's about all it does for me, anyway. After that,
it's an odd one. Like calling it a book, it's just disingenuous. It's not. It's words, and it's a story, but there are so many steps between writing down a story and it being a book that I don't know. It feels mad to call it your novel. Do you know what I mean?
It does, and obviously we're a short story podcast, so one of the reasons that I want to highlight it is that feels very different when you're writing a short story, because you can create and edit and draft a short story in a day. If you absolutely had to, you can make it in a day, because you can put your first pass on the page. You can edit it because it's only, in our case, up to 1,500 words, which isn't a lot of words to edit. And then you can play with the draft a little bit, move stuff around. You can end up with 2 or 3 drafts done and then a final draft. And that's the one that we perform. And sometimes it takes us a day, sometimes it takes us 2 weeks. It never takes us years. And that's the stage that I'm at the moment. I've been working on my book for a fucking long time. And sometimes it's really difficult to see the progress. So I'm sort of like misty-eyed to those days of like, 50,000 words. I feel so like I've accomplished something.
Yeah.
it's a very frustrating process. It's a very rewarding process as well, but only if you can actually feel that progress.
It's like threading a needle with mittens on, isn't it?
More like threading a million needles with mittens on. Because
Mittens
it
on your
just keeps going.
feet that you're having to use to thread the needle.
Yeah, definitely. But that's the process that we're going through at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
We are creating novels. They are on the way, and recently Nico did complete in a sort of like a NaNoWriMo context, a first draft. I know
Yeah.
you've got like ums and ahs about what to call, whether you want to call it a first draft or not, 0.5 or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But by the NaNoWriMo standard, you did it. You completed it last year,
Hmm.
and then this year you've actually written enough words to finish telling the story.
Make it a book. Well, no,
Make
not a book,
the
a story.
yeah the story, and then there's the process to make it into a book, isn't there?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to talk about today. Since getting writing his ending and getting the amount of words that he wanted for the first draft, for want of a better word, Nico's now been drafting. So what's your drafting process so far this month?
Uh, I mean, a lot of it is panic, I think. Yeah, just abject. I'm saying that in a very flippant way, but it's it's been actually very difficult for me, this process. What I'm doing is I've got all the chapters marked in the book, so I can jump to one at random, and I've got a list, and I'm just picking points in the book. So rather than doing it all chronologically, doing sort of chunks of chapters, but working through the chapter, taking words out, putting phrases in, moving things around, adding a lot more full stops, because that is my greatest crime is that everything is run on sentences when you can just allow for a breath. Not everything has to be a comma.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the biggest part of the process for me really has been realizing that I don't know a lot about drafting, and I don't know anything really about editing. So it's
I mean that's a big statement and one that potentially wouldn't make much sense to people listening. I think because
yeah,
like for my money, you're one of the best storytellers I've ever encountered, and that's one of the reasons that we do this podcast together.
yeah,
We're 100 or so episodes into this pod. You've read out dozens and dozens of stories that you've created. So I think if people are listening, or even for me listening, knowing that you're struggling to that degree is a bit like watching a lion get pulled apart by dogs. Um, and that's I think we can work on that. Basically, is what I'm
yeah,
saying. I think we can progress that inside this episode.
yeah,
Because we are going to hear a mid draft from Nico,
yeah.
but then we're also going to talk about the editing and the drafting process. Um, but we'll probably save that for after we've heard where he's at the moment. So take it away, Nico.
Chapter 3, in which we finally meet someone reasonable and another quite the opposite. Kitara exhaled slowly. She was, it had to be said, the brains of the operation, or at the very least, one hemisphere of them. The operation, in this instance, was roughly 2,000 bearded warriors and half again as many without beards. Both camps had a reasonable representation across the entire gender spectrum. Firstly, because it's bloody cold where they come from, and also because the dwarves are surprisingly forward thinking, especially compared to the civilized humans. It had become increasingly stressful trying to reason with their allies of late, for a number of reasons. The first, quite simply, was that the humans considered themselves to be right about everything, without taking the time to educate themselves at all. It paid to know your allies and enemies well, especially when the two were interchangeable. Secondly, they were extremely condescending. Kitara had yet to work out if this was because she was a dwarf or a woman. She had the reasonable inkling that it was a combination of the two. She had given the Lord High Marshal a series of dwarven texts on Orcish war culture at their last meeting. Centuries of mountain disputes drilled down into easy-to-manage tomes. They were heavy with historic casualties. Each word of them had been written in blood, both Orcish and Dwarven. Metaphorically, anyway. The manner in which he'd taken them had very quickly informed her opinion of the man. He was pompous without having earned the right to be so. He couldn't have grown a decent beard if he tried, yet curled his moustache like a blacksmith would a breastplate. Everything about him, from his slicked grey hair to his perfectly unscuffed boots, told a story. The story of a military commander who had never slogged through the mud with provisions on his back. A man who'd never watched a sharpened edge pass through a friend. He likely didn't have any. In spite of his clear lack of understanding of how battles are truly fought and won, he had assured her that "we know very well how to handle savages." He'd said it with a glint in his eye, and a sideways glance at her coarse bristles. It was a look that she knew all too well. He was a small-minded arsehole. It was, even with a cursory glance at the state of the human camp, obvious they'd not studied the texts. No one had taken the time to move the residents of the small towns and villages into any of the Empire's fortifications. No trenches had been dug to slow the Orcish advance. By the deep stones, it didn't seem like they'd even really looked at how to properly kill one of the things. Now, with the prospect of having to talk to him again made a reality, things were bleak. The state all of this was in was going to nigh on ensure a massacre. Humans had never been good listeners, had they? Putting it off would only give her less time to instruct them on how to remedy this, so it was time for decisive action. She allowed herself another big sigh, pulled her pauldron straight, and lifted the flap to the Lord High Marshal's tent. The blustering fool was bent almost double over a large map dotted with figurines. His cheeks were puffed a rich red like blustering beetroots. Froth escaped his rapidly working lips and settled delicately in his overstyled facial adornments. He was reviewing the recent reports of their battle's outcomes. Based on the small number of little human models and the extremely large number of little orc models, things were not going well. She noticed the orc troops were reinforced by the salt and pepper shakers, and an ink pot. Evidently, whoever made the war table had underestimated the greenskin numbers. This must be why she'd been summoned. Master tactician she was, arse out of fire puller less so. A cough announced her entry, and the Lord High Marshal turned his sweat-beaded face towards her. In his doubled state, it was closer to intimacy with the man than she'd ever encountered. "It's here, the orc expert." This was said with a degree of malice that coated the room like marmalade on a slice of hot bread. It even had the bits in. Kitara chose to ignore the use of the word. She'd learned to dig beneath that sort of thing. The term rise above wasn't commonly used by the dwarf kind. Going up was generally considered a bit of a rubbish idea. "She is, yes," Kitara responded, "though I make no claim of expertise." It was said plainly, with no anger, not even the lash of sarcasm. It hurts them more if you give them nothing back at all, you see. "Not an expert. You come in here bearing bloody books, and now my people are dead." "Yes, your people and my books, which you obviously didn't read. If it hadn't been for the fact that a lot of probably young and inexperienced men had been marched to their dooms, it might have brought Kitara some satisfaction. Instead, it made her feel heavy with their loss. Not knowing them didn't matter. It all could have been avoided, or at least averted. You asked for tactical advice. We offered what we could." A spark seemed to flare for a moment at the point where the pair's gazes met in the heart of the tent. A few of the advisors and ranking soldiers were doing a reasonably good job of sneaking out so as to not be involved in the coming explosion. This was a difficult thing to do, on account of the exit being a great big flap directly in the Lord High Marshal's eye line. There seemed to be a conflict even more ferocious than the one depicted on the table going on in the commander's mind. Bits of face often left still rubbed tiredness out of their muscles and twitched. Something so unspeakable it might get you banned from being out in public surged behind his teeth. The words would have slipped out easily in other company. Instead, he settled on, "Have a seat." When he turned to take his, the attempted escapees made their final push. They were left alone. Katara did not sit. The indignity of trying to use one of the human chairs without a lot of puffing and panting, or having to take off at least one layer of chainmail, was not a pleasure she would be affording the Lord High Commander. Instead, she placed her onyx-headed warhammer at the table's side, its handle resting delicately against it. She stood, her arms crossed over her chest. A sculptor would have had a field day in there. These sorts of dynamic poses tend to be quite short-lived in reality. "Allow me to speak plainly, Katara." The words oozed disrespect. Not the offhand disrespect of the teenager rebuking a parent. This was the warfare of words. "Of course, Percival." He twitched. She saw it. The omission of his rank had rankled him, rather ironically, it must be said. But if he wasn't going to call her king-in-waiting Katara Ranulfsdotter, then she wasn't going to be calling him Lord High Bloody Commander. She allowed herself a moment to enjoy his squirming before she pressed the conversation onwards. "As you know, I came to help, so let me do just that. Speak away." Percival's knuckles were turning white on the edge of the table. An almost inaudible squeak was escaping the wood inside his closed hands. "Well, Kitara, our forces are diminished to near breaking point. You claim to have come to offer assistance, yet I saw no dwarf on the front lines. I see no weeping dwarfen widows. Where were you?" That absolute bastard. He was going to try and make this into a failure on her part. Politics were a dance she only knew half the steps for, and right now she strained to hear the beat they were supposed to follow. Frustration welled in her, and Katara took her turn to feel the flush of rage. "Our widows don't weep, Percival. They take up arms, and they fight until they win or die. My kind has held the front line against the orcs for 100 of years. It's only now that it spills into your lands." "Then you've not held them, have you?" His words cut like an axe blow. A dwarf was little without their pride. Well, actually, in some ways a dwarf was always little, but not in any way that really means anything. And that was a blow against their honour. It was, after a fashion, true. They had suffered a terrible loss at Whistlewind Pass. It was then that her father had told her to warn the humans. A lot of good it had done. "And now we find ourselves dead, in droves, thanks to your ineptitude." He spat the final words like they were foul-tasting. "So I ask you, what will you do for us now, having failed us so far?" Kitara exhaled slowly. What would Ava say? She was always so calm, outside of battle's ferocity at least. The strange duality of wishing her partner was here, and being glad she didn't have to endure this atmosphere, was simply more confusion. She would take a balanced path. Accept no blame. Offer none, either. "I suppose that all depends what you would ask of us, Lord High Commander." The sting of the returned formality felt like a loss, but peace was, of course, so very important. Especially, she thought again, when your enemies and allies can change so quickly. He grinned a wide grin, which turned the corners of his ridiculous moustache towards the pavilion's roof. Surrounded as he was by maps depicting the slain and mounds of the Emperor's coin, waiting to be palmed to sellswords and pocketed by generals, he painted a frighteningly accurate picture of the dwarf's idea of humankind. He turned, and from a box took a crudely carved figure. Even from a distance, its beard and silver-painted body were evident. With a flourish, he placed it on the table's war map, between the small number of human figures and the enormous number of orcs.
That is very much my jam. So I like. I really enjoy this kind of like military fantasy stuff.
Yeah.
And that like the way that we're in the war tent, you can see how the war's progressing, and it's very much like this scene is wonderfully set against the backdrop of the problems that these characters are facing at this stage. Like that's a really solid idea for a scene, I think.
Thank you.
I like it a lot.
It's nice because it's got some jokes in it. Obviously, there's a couple of little like
Yeah,
jabs
yeah,
and gags
yeah. It's
and
still
plays
funny.
on word, but it's got a lot more. I was pleased with how much kind of tone setting and world building I was managed to get into that while letting, because it would be really easy to do exactly like we spoke about in the last episode. It'd be easier to do an exposition dump and explain exactly what was happening, but letting it kind of unfold slowly. It's not something I do a lot of in my writing, so I'm pleased with the sort of shape of the scene, especially after a second look at it.
Yeah, just in terms of the shape of the scene, I almost wonder. Like my only note on like a macro note for the scene would
Hmm.
be potentially some dread from her, from Katara,
Yeah.
that she knows what's going to be asked of her because she's a tactical genius.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a great idea.
Um, so she knows that the dwarves have suffered this loss, that it's had a knock-on effect for the humans, and she knows from the start of the scene that the humans are struggling. So I think she knows that idea of like the politics occurring to her at the end, and the Lord, this the Lord Commander dude
Yeah.
is going to put these dwarves between the humans and the greenskins. Is a good. Um, it would be nice to set that up, I think, because part of her character is that she is an advisor on military matters. So I think she would
Yeah.
see that coming, and also dread it.
Yes. No, that's a really good note.
Yeah, it's a bit Hitchcockian, isn't it, to show the audience the bomb under the table
Yeah.
before you have the scene. Um, so that could be good. I think he sometimes was Lord Commander and sometimes was Lord Marshal. So that might be
Yeah.
one of
I think there was a change of title at some point. So yeah,
yeah
I definitely need to
yeah
look at that. Yeah.
yeah. It's definitely Lord High Commander and Lord High Marshal at different points. But that's an easy enough one to catch.
Yes.
Yes. So this is a. Do you want to just explain what led to this draft? So where are we? This has had
So this was sort of spaffed onto a page, I think last year,
right.
and then this has had. There have been some like little changes in personality and little like things that happen later that this has got some foreshadowing for, and so this was going back through putting those in. Like if I even just reading it out loud that once, I desperately want to go back through and change a lot of punctuation. I'll tell you that
Mm,
much because there were the the performer in me knew where to put the pauses in the way that I don't think the writer in me does as well.
okay.
So
So
that's
you had to perform it in order to know where you needed to
yes,
direct other people to be able to read it, sort of thing.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I think I would agree with that. I think uh, some I think it's very clearly better on a punctuation standpoint than your first draft, which we saw in the first week of this Nano season,
oh yeah,
because in that there was lots of run-on sentences and like jokes all crammed into one like long sentence when they could have been expanded out and done a bit better.
yeah,
Because obviously you write very eloquently and very funnily, but it hides that if it's all squashed together.
Yeah, there's
Um,
nowhere for it to breathe or go.
exactly. Yeah. Um, I really enjoyed all of the sort of like dwarfisms, if that makes sense, in the
Yes.
in the thing. So like by the deep stones, dig beneath. Like it felt very real. I know you have a great love of the fantasy race of dwarves,
Yeah.
and I could feel that. I could feel that a lot, almost to the point where it felt like I was like, I did have the thought. I was like, why is he writing about goblins? He should just write about dwarves. But obviously, you can do both. So
Yeah.
why not do both and really make it like a multi-sided, multiracial conflict? Um, that just on that racism that this Lord High Marshal dude
Yeah.
exhibits. There is there's a lot of I don't know what the correct term is at the moment, but there's quite a lot of political correctness in your writing.
Yes.
Like you make the points about like gender inclusion and racism and stuff in this short segment. So I'm assuming that it's throughout the whole book.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think that's very good when it's characterized, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if a character is expressing that point of view, then it works. So in this, you have your snarky direct narrator do it.
Yeah.
Is it always that case, or does it sometimes bleed over into other parts?
Oh, it's always the snarky guy.
Or always the
The
direct narrator
fourth
sort of thing?
wall. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The come on guys, we're better than this
Hmm.
voice, as opposed because like sort of in world, that's not necessarily something that would they would feel it, but they don't have our sort of political purview or
No. Yes. Okay. Well, that's. I think there's definitely a place for it. Um, there was just one moment inside where it kind of took me out of it a little bit. When's the bit
okay.
where he gets racist with her, the Lord High Marshal? Yeah. Okay. Here it is. So the line is when the Lord High Marshal is sort of is staring daggers at her after she says, "You asked for tactical advice. We offered what we could."
Yeah.
There's a bit where, without the snarky direct narrator, it says something so unspeakable it might get you banned from being out in public surged between his teeth. The words would have slipped out easily in other company. Instead, he settled on, "Have a seat." That's not a direct narration, and that's the political correctness again.
Ah, that's probably it. Probably should be like from the tone, it should be. So
But it's not.
that's
It's not an aside though. It's embedded in the
okay.
narration. So I think that it it's the reason that was a stopping point for me, just in my head, was that
Hmm.
I feel like he would racially abuse this woman
Yeah.
because he's a dickhead. Like that's just and so there's a thing when you're creating at least for me when I'm creating like stories and stuff like that. If a character would say something absolutely horrendous to another character, they need to say that, even if I don't agree with it or if
But I think
um.
the only reason he doesn't is because of her rank.
But he doesn't respect her rank because refers to her by her first name. Like
That's
it's
true.
a
Yeah.
he doesn't respect it, and also we know that he knows that he's got her over a barrel, tactically speaking, as
Yeah.
well from the end. So I think if she's like ticking off like how much he's going to spend this coin that he's got on her,
Yeah.
that's one moment where he could spend some by just say something about her being a dwarf
Yeah.
or whatever the word is that you want to use. But I think you could just elevate that by keeping it in the direct narration and then
Okay.
allowing your
Yeah. Yeah.
character to not be like characters shouldn't be politically correct. It's okay for this like secondary direct narrator to be, but characters should be just characters. They shouldn't be like I feel that they shouldn't be written like with like a conscious
Yeah.
um, expression of our um, ideologies, if that makes sense. Um,
I mean, just because you'll enjoy it, I'm taking notes from the feedback you give me,
yeah,
even though I could listen to it whenever I wanted. But I just wrote down, allow Percival to be a racist.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, because it's sort of show don't tell, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, But anyway, there's loads of reasons why I think that would work. Like he's heinous, so make him heinous.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, build on the tension that we know should exist from the ending of the scene at the start of
Yeah.
the scene, and keep it going throughout because I think that would help with the scene. Um, but there's some other great stuff in here as well. So there's like the salt and pepper pots being used for reinforcements is wonderful. I really enjoy that. That's like classic dry British humor. I love it.
Yeah.
Um, that's very much my kind of jam. That. And speaking of jam, when you the marmalade with and it's still got the bits in it.
Yeah.
That's a great line as well. I also wrote down harmalade. Um,
So for the listeners, that's something I said during the reading that's sadly not going to make it. Maybe I'll stick it at the end somewhere. But
I feel like you need to do like a goblin or like an orc line of preserves and include in it like stuff like marmalade and bam instead of jam and stuff like that. Like,
it's a great one.
yeah,
I think marmalade is they make it in a glass jar originally, then they put that in a bag and smash it and mix it all together.
and then put it in like the bladder of a goat and throw it at you or something. Very good. No, I loved all of that stuff. Like, there's so many like bits that were unpolished diamonds in the first draft. You can
Yeah.
see them now that they're not crowded together and struggling to see the sun, and just allowed to you're sort of sitting in the jokes a bit more. It's getting good. It's really getting good, which is a fantastic thing to witness. Um, yeah, I'm really enjoying it. Um, I have more notes if you want more notes.
I welcome them always.
It will come as a shock to no one that I have more to say on this. Uh, actual battle numbers for scale.
Okay.
I found that opening bit about half as many again without beards quite confusing.
Okay.
Um, because we know that the dwarves aren't on the map yet because that happens at the end.
Yes.
Um, it's difficult because you go from right at the start of the chapter from her talking about the how many dwarves and how many humans there are to her seeing the humans on the thing. I don't. It could be just a little bit clearer, like so, like
Okay. That's definitely
yeah,
a clarity thing because they're all dwarves at the beginning, but some have beards, some don't. So that definitely needs more clarification. Definitely.
Oh Christ! Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you saying that Katara has 2,000 bearded male
And
dwarves and 4,000 female dwarves?
no.
Okay, all right. Take another look at that. Make sure it's
Yeah,
clear
yeah.
because that's yeah, fascinating. Okay, yeah. That's it's always interesting where these things.
I mean, that's exactly what this is for, though, because
Yeah.
something that, I'm looking at it and go, yeah, I know what that means, but of course I know what it means. I wrote it down.
Mhm. So there's the bit where she. Sorry, could you direct me to where she is wondering whether it's because she's a dwarf or whether she's a woman? That one. There we go. Secondly, they're extremely condescending. Katara had yet to work out if this was because she was a dwarf or a woman. She had a reasonable inkling it was a combination of the two. Right. Again, that's not direct aside, and it's the snarky political correctness, isn't it? So
Yes.
that could change potentially, or is it Katara's one? And if it's Katara thinking that, then she might call herself a female instead of a woman because it's got human connotations.
Okay.
I don't. Maybe that might just be
Yeah.
my um, like she was a dwarf or a female dwarf, like which
Yeah.
uh, potentially just a little bit of work on that line. I think because that one stood out for me.
I've just because
Uh,
I've been toying with it, I've been using the term dwarfen and also elfen. So the old way of saying those words, as opposed to dwarven and elven,
hmm.
the sort of Tolkien way.
I was going to
And
say I think I just heard Tolkien roll in his grave in order to draw his sword. Like it. That's.
but I'm not sure where to land on it.
I think it can be whatever you want it to be, really.
Yeah.
Like as long as it doesn't kick people out of it too much.
But yeah, dwarfen is an interesting one because obviously, in theory, both words work. Dwarven works slightly better. That's why the king of linguists made it that.
Mm.
But yeah, it's one that every time I scroll past it or I read over it, I think, is that do I like it? Am I just being different to be different there? Does that actually is that of any benefit? I don't know that it
Difficult
is.
one to say, like, because
Yeah,
if it's not, if there's no like clear point where you can point to it and say that is where the benefit is, then potentially you're tripping up an audience
been out.
for now.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, I'm not sure how to advise you on that one. That feels like a top level. You're the writer. This is your text.
Yeah, yeah. I just
That's
I want one to
yeah,
voice that one was. I think that's
yeah, for sure. It's an interesting thing to voice. Um, Anyone that's familiar with Tolkien or other fantasy novels that include these kind of races is going to be like, huh, the first time you do that. And potentially, maybe that huh would build into a fuck this, which would be my worry.
yeah.
Um, but then again, if you, as I say, if you can find a way to get value out of the change, then it could work. One to think about, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so the section where Katara realizes that a lot of people have been sent to their deaths. She says, "Now with the prospect of having to talk to him again made a reality, things were bleak. The state all of this was in was going to nigh on ensure a massacre." I feel like nigh on is a bit unnecessary, and it doesn't quite work in that context
Yeah, okay.
because nigh on means like it's approaching, it's not quite, etc. Like we already have that from what you're saying.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because that came out, went back in, came out, went back in as I
Right,
was
interesting.
looking at that bit and I was like, I'll leave it there for now.
But like if you think about the sentence, the state
Yeah.
all of this was in was going to nigh on ensure a massacre, compared to the state all of this was in was going to ensure a massacre.
Yeah.
That's a lot stronger. It's
Yes.
scary. Like nigh on is like a theoretical intellectual spacer tool between
Yeah.
the reality of the situation and Katara. So if she is suppressing it and trying to just intellectualize it, then that's fine. But I feel like she's got a very strong head on her shoulders and she is pragmatic as fuck.
Yeah.
So I don't think she'd think like that. And it's sort of you're half inside her head.
Yeah.
Um,
I get you.
because
I
you
get you.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, so
No,
that was
that's a great
yeah,
note. I'm
cool.
glad because that is one I wasn't sure on. So
Mm.
that's exactly what I want to hear.
Fascinating, isn't it? When you sort of like tool over something for a while and then somebody else goes, "No, what the? Come on, change it, change it."
I mean, we've had a couple of these when I said the midnight countenance of his face, and I was like, I'm pretty sure this is redundant. And you were like, oh, honey, of course it is. Countenance means his face. Yeah, I know.
um, Whistlewind Pass. I liked that name. I thought that was great. I love a little bit of alliteration.
Yeah.
I think that's all. That's all good. There was some like word choices. I think you have politics were a dance. I think there should be politics was a dance. Which
Oh
is taken,
yes.
yeah. And I think there was another one right at the end. Right at the end. One sec. Yeah, so there's one right at the end
Mhm.
where Katara exhaled slowly. What would Ava say? She was always so calm outside of battle's ferocity, at least. The strange duality of wishing her partner was here. I think it's were here in that instance. Wishing,
Okay. Yeah.
like wish you were here, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, those what I think of those things are, like obviously they're very important. Like grammar is important,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it sounds wrong when people get it wrong. Even to people that have never studied it or really engaged with it properly. If English is your first language or second, third, and you're great at it, whatever, people are going to pick up on little things like that. And I think of them as almost. I don't know whether this is a positive thing for me or not, but I think of them as almost superficial.
Yeah. I get
Because
that.
although they're really important to the structure of a sentence in terms of the editing process, I feel like they can be fixed later on. Like they
It's
because it's you can just do Control F was and go and check all your instances of was through your
yeah,
novel and just make sure
it's
it was okay.
one of those weird ones as well where those kind of words, your brain just kind of jumps them when you're reading. I don't think I read them particularly closely because I'm
Right.
looking at everything around them. So
Yeah.
that can be why they're,
So
it's like
that that
textually
that leads me
sometimes.
perfectly on to what I was going to say, which is that when I'm looking for those kind of like nitpicky, grammary sort of things,
Yeah.
what I do is I read paragraphs backwards.
Oh,
So you edit in reverse. So you read each sentence in a paragraph, starting with the last one and move back. What that does is it it completely puts them on their own, which means it's impossible to run on. You know, when you're reading, because you naturally, take in a lot of information and read quite quickly,
yeah.
you build up head of steam and you can just charge straight over words like that. You can't do that if you're deliberately breaking down that process and reading backwards.
So
It,
cool.
yeah. So if you, it's really time consuming, but it's that's part of the course really on this process that we're going through. Um,
That, that really caught me off guard. It's really time consuming.
yeah, but it just
Uh,
if a section isn't working, that's my like that's like a tool that I just reach for in my toolbox. I'm just like, right, fuck it,
yeah,
I'm gonna go backwards, and it almost always works. I would say. Um, I think typically you've then got to revisit it just a little bit to make sure that the flow is still there, so you haven't like damaged the way that you were telling the story by fixing the grammar.
yeah,
But it's a necessary bit. Um, then the other thing is that obviously when because I've I've seen this. I've had access to this little section for a couple of days now,
yeah,
which is pretty unusual for us. Um, and when it first came across, it was unformatted. And whilst that's also a superficial thing, it's actually really important for going back and editing, because
yeah.
if because when this came across, it was initially everything was center aligned rather than left
Hmm.
aligned, um, which I find helps me to edit if everything's left aligned.
Yeah.
I don't like justified whilst editing. Do you know what I mean by justified? Where the words like take up the whole line and the word processor automatically puts space in to space it out to pad the line.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't like that when I'm editing because that creates like weird gaps.
Yeah.
But so I left a line, and then I also double space it. And the reason that you double space it is so that you can just the lines don't crowd together, and you can maybe see errors that you wouldn't normally be able to see. Um, so what I would do if you're in the drafting process and and you're editing all these different chapters, go
Yeah.
through one of the first things that you should do for all of them when you go through that process is Control A, and then it's like Control 2.0 or something to double line space, left align, and make sure everything's like looks roughly like how it should look. So, for example, your direct narrator asides. What I did when I was taking a look at this was I put them into italics to make sure that the tone is different, because I think
Yeah.
ultimately there is going to have to be some typographical difference between your narrators in order for it to make sense to your audience.
I think even making sure you're in the right font is a good thing though,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it's very possible that 'cause I started off in Calibri
Hmm.
and I was really struggling, and I changed it to Arial, and there's just a little bit more space between the letters, and it's
Yeah,
almost indistinguishable, really, but it makes it easier to read. So if you're doing this at home, if you're working through your stuff, even if you're okay with your font, change it because it makes it look different and you'll read it differently. Just have a go, swap your fonts around, change the font size, make it a little bit bigger, just
I
so
think
that your eye attacks it in a different way.
I think it's a good note. Also, knowing whether serif or sans serif works for you best as well. So
Mm,
the what that is, I'm sure a lot of people do know that already. But in a font, if it has like feet, so if like you have a capital K and it has little feet on the bottom that stick out, that's serifed font,
mm.
because it has these like little feet. So Times New Roman is a good example of a serifed font, for example. And then sans serif, which is what Calibri and Arial are they're without that. So it means
Yeah.
sans just means without. So whatever works best for your head and your eyes when you're in the editing process, for sure. Um, yeah, and just and just like a quick spell check and stuff like that. Just the things that are gonna trip me up when I'm editing is I'll get obsessed with the fact that I made a weird grammatical error or a spelling mistake. So I feel
Yeah.
like just doing like a it doesn't have to be perfect. You're not doing your final grammar check, but just once over the bit that you're gonna do, just so when you actually come to edit it, it's sort of ready to be edited.
Yeah,
And
you can do the hard parts because you're not stuck on the soft bits.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I think once you've done that to the whole novel, which actually won't take that long, as opposed to um, this other editing process that we're talking about, which is far more sort of cerebral, and you've got to be deep in that storyteller mindset to do it. This can be done as like a checkbox, and it will
Yeah.
massively help you to do the other thing. So I think it's a good point to start your drafting process. It's just to make sure everything's formatted, had a spell check, and laid out correctly so that you can read it properly.
Yeah.
Um,
Good
that's
notes.
that is how I start an editing process, a drafting process, and then things get a little bit more intense and time consuming. But what I would say is that that is already looking so much better than that first draft that we did in the first week of this Nano season, because that was a really brutal process to read out a bare first draft.
Yeah.
Um, and this is obviously more polished. It still needs work, and
Yeah.
as with everybody's at this stage, but it's very clear that you are progressing towards a goal of a final draft here. And
Yeah.
it's funny. It's a good scene. It's got lots of bits. Like if it wasn't good, I wouldn't have engaged with it with that Hitchcock feedback that I gave.
Yeah. I get you.
So it's definitely working, and I think it's going really well. But as you say, because you're maybe a bit more novice about editing in this
Yeah.
way than I am, I think just maybe pick up on some of those tools, and you with those tools could be a scary thing.
It's definitely been an interesting one. I mean, I'm happy to talk about mental health on the podcast, but in all of the creative things I do, and I do a lot of creative things, I get really bad imposter syndrome. And even when it's things that I know I can do, I worry that someone's going to step out and say, "Ha ha, you did that bit wrong," or this real horrible abuse of myself in the place of the imagined person who's never going to do it. And I've been very guilty of doing that to myself in the last few days, possibly even the last week with this story.
Mm.
And this has been very comforting, actually, to have someone who I trust implicitly, especially when it comes to literature, say to me, "You're on the right path. You are doing it," and you know, even though you don't need it, kind of giving you permission to write
Yeah,
because
that's an interesting point. Giving you permission to write. That's a fascinating one.
it's something you have to seize. And there are people, and when things are bad, you remember the bad things. So, when I started
Yeah,
worrying and feeling like, oh my God, am I doing the right thing? I immediately thought of the people who've said, yeah, but are you really a writer? Are you published? Have you done this? Have you done this? But and you can't be
yeah,
published until you've fucking written something. So
very much
you
so.
have to start somewhere.
And whilst those people do exist in the world, I think we've even encountered them in the process of doing this podcast. Not talking about any guests at all, by the way. Just generally online, we're talking about here. Um, their opinion is so irrelevant as to be laughable.
Yeah.
Um, and anyone that is looking at you drafting a novel and being like, you don't deserve to do this, doesn't deserve to have a voice on anything, in my opinion, because that's someone who is just trying to keep other people down, and
Yeah.
to internalize that voice is very dangerous. And I know a lot of people have that issue, which is we were sort of talking about imposter syndrome and self negativity and self criticism, going past the point of usefulness.
Yeah.
Um, you always have permission to write. you are a very creative person. You do, as you say, you do lots of creative endeavors. You have permission to create whenever you want to do it, because I feel that it's important that you do create. So many people work professionally as script writers, novelists, whatever, because they happen to have caught a slipstream, caught a lucky break here and there.
Yeah.
And what they do is fine, but it's sort of like, if you watch most TV that's on at the moment, or most like Marvel movies or whatever, it's just this like, there's no soul to it. There's no
Yeah.
real like writing chops to it, and that's something you've got in spades. So you need to get through this more almost like admin stuff of the edit and find a way to conquer the mental blocks around permission to write, because I have absolutely no doubt that what's on the other side of that is excellent productivity and wonderful acts of creation. So do it.
Right, you are.
Yep. Right, come on then. Let's wrap it up. I think that was a big one, because we
Yeah.
potentially quite a dry one as well, because we were just talking about editing a lot and like nitpicking a draft. But
Yeah. Sorry,
hopefully,
gang.
yeah, hopefully people are enjoying it. If you're not, well, that's fine, because we're going to be going back to our regular programming fairly soon once NaNoWriMo is done.
And if you don't enjoy that, what the fuck are you doing here? Who are you? What's wrong with you people?
No, we really appreciate the fact that people are listening and getting involved and stuff like that. So, big love to everyone, and thanks for showing us this draft, Nico.
Thanks for riding along.
Next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren? Like marmalade.